Now, it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Beverly Baker, who is an associate professor and director of language assessment, official languages, and bilingualism at the University of Ottawa. Welcome, Dr. Baker.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really very, very pleased to be here, and I've enjoyed the conference so far. So I'll just share my screen now. You can just let me know whether or not you're seeing it okay. I'm going to go with yes. I'm not getting any message from anyone. Okay, so as promised in my talk today, I'm going to be unpacking this idea of language assessment literacy for most of the major stakeholders. So, of course, language assessment literacy is a theme of this conference. It's a major stream, right? And I want to actually, as I go through the presentation, show you some pictures as I go for some groups that I work with, groups of teachers, groups of students, and teacher trainers who work in this area of language assessment literacy. This is my colleague, Brenda Germain, and she is a teacher who teaches Mi'kmaq, which is an Indigenous language here in Canada, a Mi'kmaq immersion program for young students, where she I was able to learn a lot about her assessment practices in this nature-based program, where she assesses students' language abilities both on the land and in the classroom. So it's a theme of the conference, and it is a very hot topic in language assessment research and in practice right now, and rightfully so. You see that there's been a wealth of very interesting information and initiatives that have been shared here at the conference so far, including as well the panel on teacher education and training for language assessment. So, so people who are interested in language assessment literacy, in general terms, they're interested in how knowledge of language assessment competency is represented, and also how the competency can be developed and which elements of the competency are necessary for different groups of people. So in this talk, I really want to discuss how the answers to all those questions really vary a lot, depending on who we're talking about. So this is not an exhaustive list, of course, but most of the major stakeholders can be put into one of these three groups. So the first is made up of the people who are actually being assessed. So the test takers or students. So I want to talk about their language assessment literacy in terms of transparency and autonomy today. Secondly, there's professional groups. So these are teachers, admissions officers, policymakers, and others. So some of these people are the ones who are doing the assessing, but all of them I've put in a group for many reasons, but they all directly make use of assessment information in their own jobs. Now, the third group, they're once removed from the direct activities of language assessment, but they're part of a society where language assessment informs societal decisions, right? You might be the parent of a student who has to do a language test, or you might be working in a job where some of your colleagues had to do a language test in order to be certified to work alongside you. So this group also includes the media and media representations of language assessment. This is another colleague of mine. His name is Widno Maurice, and he works with young children as well as high school children in Haiti teaching English. He's part of a professional learning community that I'll talk about a little bit later. But I've got a little survey for you. If you could put in the chat which of the stakeholder groups you fall into, or that you have ever fallen into. So take a moment and list all that apply. You can put all the letters, if you like, into the chat. And some of them are starting to come in now, I think. Oh, we've got a real alphabet soup coming in here now. And I see there's more than one person who has said all. So all of them apply. So you see that we can look at language assessment, what we need to know about language assessment from all of these different points of view, because we have experience very often from several, if not all of these different points of view. Yeah, look, everyone's coming in there. Thank you very much. Assessment knowledge or competency for all of these stakeholders, no matter who they are, it can be classified now. We've heard it discussed in this conference already as knowledge as opposed to skills, or knowledge, conceptual knowledge of principles as opposed to skills. But another way of looking at it, and I mean that's fine too. There's no problem with that I can see, and no contradiction. You can also think of it as two different types of knowledge: declarative or propositional knowledge, as opposed to procedural knowledge. And so you see that I have some examples here of different types of knowledge that fall into these two categories that have been associated with language assessment literacy. Several of these came from Linda Taylor's work in 2013. And I also followed up on this with a colleague of mine, and we sort of expanded upon these terms. So this is also not an exhaustive list, but it's an idea of some of the types of knowledge that are needed when we talk about this general category of language assessment literacy. And here are some examples of each. Now take a look at them and you see that I've got ideas of different stakeholders sometimes for some of the questions that I've asked here. You see the declarative knowledge is the knowledge what, right? And procedural knowledge or skills is the how. And so for theoretical conceptual knowledge, for example, I wrote, what does validity mean? Now, this could work for maybe all of these stakeholders. We all have to have a certain understanding of validity, right? I mean, even the general public needs to know that when you've assessed nurses, for example, on their ability to perform in the target language in their workplace, then we're going to have an assessment that actually assesses their ability to do that and not some other ability in English. And that's a knowledge of validity, right? Without even necessarily needing to know the term. Whereas if you're a researcher in this area, you would need to have an in-depth knowledge of validation theory and that sort of thing. But I would say this would apply to all stakeholders. You see, though, that if you look at collaboration, I've written, how do I work with my fellow students to provide feedback to improve our performance? And so I actually had students in mind. So that's how you could ask a question for collaboration that actually targets a particular stakeholder, students who need to learn appropriate ways for peer in order to assess their peers. So let's take a look at this first group together, okay? So students and test takers, people who are being assessed or being subjected to assessment. Now, transparency, of course, is a concept that we're all familiar with, right? The idea is it's fair to be transparent, to make language assessment expectations explicit. The idea is that it can support performance, and also it can support students' self-regulation as well, right? But just defining transparency in this way, I think could go a lot farther and become a way of looking at language assessment literacy. This doesn't go far enough because it's too passive, right? It doesn't allow for the development of language assessment literacy because students don't have an opportunity, or test takers don't have an opportunity to learn about the assessment in really a meaningful way. They're just being informed sort of about what's happening to them, which is better than nothing, but we can go further than that, I think. So if people being assessed have the opportunity to actually be engaged in assessment activities themselves, then they gain a different sort of awareness. they can potentially learn a lot. And language assessment literacy is just learning. And I actually like the word learning better, but it's just learning. They can potentially learn a lot more about the complexity of the learning process and how it's connected to their actual learning processes of the language. Now, I want to share with you some details of a couple of projects that I've been working on in the last couple of years that have focused on increasing students' engagement with assessment processes instead of just this passively being assessed. So in the first project, we took a rubric for a high-stakes assessment tool that we use in my institution, and we developed a test-taker-oriented version of this with language that would be more accessible to test takers rather than the graders. And then we developed an assignment for students in their advanced writing classes. So they use the rubric to grade authentic samples of the students. And we found a couple of things from doing this. We did find that the grades that they gave to the samples didn't at all match the grades that were being given as the official grades that these authentic samples had gotten. And this isn't surprising. And it wasn't the point, right? I mean, it makes sense because rubrics, just seeing a rubric doesn't make things as transparent as we think it does. We know that even though criteria are listed, we know that there are implicit criteria that play a role in the judgment that's eventually made on a grade. And we do know that these criteria, even if they are all listed exhaustively, they're interpreted differently by different people using those tools, right? So we were okay with that. The second thing that we actually found was that students learned a lot about the assessment process. They put themselves in the position of a grader. So they gave themselves a reader orientation. So they really appreciated this. They really reported that they saw academic writing in a new way after taking this position, that they were able to discuss ways that they could improve their own writing based now on all of the different elements that were revealed to them from not only getting the rubric, but actually trying to use it with real samples. So it's definitely an example of not assessment for learning so much as assessment as learning, right? The assessment process itself supported their language learning efforts. So in the second project, this is underway now. So I'm working with a team to develop a different type of placement test into our credit courses in English and in French as a second language, because I work at a bilingual university. So in this placement test, we want students to more or less place themselves in the level that's most appropriate for them. So it can be called self-directed placement. It's not self-assessment really strictly, because they're not making a judgment on their abilities, right? They're actually doing what's called kind of comparative judgment activities, among other things. They're looking at samples of real student work that's been provided by teachers in these courses, and the students gave permission for us to use. By looking at different samples of this work that have been judged to be typical of each level, the student then decides which one suits the level that they should be working on at the moment. And so they kind of decide whether or not they're actually capable of doing such work themselves, or it would be too difficult, or it would be too easy for them at this moment. So the idea is that the sum of all of these judgments put together will put them in the course that best suits their needs. So the piloting of this hasn't happened yet, but we're hoping that it's going to be more efficient, in which case there's less, measured by many things, but measured also by how many people we have to move around to different levels at the beginning of every semester. But during the pilot, we're going to be asking the students how they feel about this greater autonomy. So this takes, like I said, it takes transparency to a whole new level. They're part of this process. Now, Barry talked about at the beginning of the day the importance of having assessments linked to the local context. And this, what we're doing right now, works for our context, because the people who are actually going to be doing the test are not forced to take these courses. They're doing it for their own interest. They're not even part of their program requirements. So they're in a French program at the university, but they would like to work on their English, and vice versa. So we feel that they're going to be very motivated individuals. They really want to find the course that suits their needs the best. And so they're not going to be motivated to try to make them, get themselves in a lower class to get a higher grade or anything like that. So, so this might not work in every context, but we're developing based on the needs and the requirements of our own context. And so we're excited to see what's going to happen with this, because there haven't been a lot of projects for self-directed placement. There are some in the first language context, but very little that we're finding in second language context. So let's move to the second group now. So I guess we would all of us here would consider ourselves to be professionals, right? And that can be defined different ways. But language assessment literacy for professional groups, maybe it shouldn't be called literacy at all, because as professionals, we're always learning, we're always developing professionally. We talked already in the panel for teacher education, there was a discussion of the different frameworks for teacher professional development. And that's what we're doing. It's professional development in many other aspects of their job, and assessment is just one of them, right? Now, I've put all of these professionals in sort of one basket here, not because I think they all need pardon the same knowledge at all, but there is a pretty long literature about efficient ways to support competency development of professionals from other domains. And what I've found from these other domains might be of benefit to each one of these professional groups. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I found from some of that other reading. And some of it can be found in the literature on the professional expertise. So expertise and expert performance. So, I mean, how did we learn about our profession or professions that we belong to? We probably went through some formal period of instruction, right? Or maybe we were socialized into the profession. But in any case, we continue to learn. We don't stop learning. What I'm talking about can be useful for this initial sort of training, but also the continuing sort of development that we do throughout our professional lives. But the learning we do does take many forms. So maybe we're observing our colleagues, maybe we take workshops, maybe we continue to read up on our field. But in any case, we can take two different perspectives to this professional development. We can look at it from a learning sort of cognitive perspective, or we can look at it from a sociocultural perspective. So I'll spend a couple minutes on each one of these perspectives, okay? And this is something probably that very few of you has looked at, unless you work in engineering or in expert performance, or you've had that kind of experience in your lives. But cognitive systems engineering, it's a cognitive approach to professional learning. So it involves knowledge elicitation from experts. And from eliciting knowledge from experts, it creates a knowledge representation. Now, we've done something like this before in language assessment research with people who are grading. We sometimes have examined the decision-making behavior of graders as they use a rating scale to develop scores. And we try to classify those decision-making behaviors, which are generally cognitive behaviors. So we've done a bit of cognitive engineering in our field, but really kind of very little. The goal is really to build systems and technologies and tools that support sort of optimum cognitive development for our jobs based on what we find out from the experts, the masters, the people who are best at it. And they do this with research methods that we're very familiar with, like observation in the workplace and in-depth cognitive interviewing and things that we actually are, nothing that's really brand new as far as that goes. But I'm going to give you an example right now that goes really kind of far away from applied linguistics, but there's certainly many connections we can make. Let's look at landmine detection. This is an application of cognitive systems engineering. Okay, So this was a researcher named Staszewski, and okay, so the way it works with landmine detection is that it's done with metal detectors, but mines have less and less metal in them. So it's a very, very difficult thing to actually detect mines with metal detectors. It's a very specialized job. Most people are not very good at it. So when he was doing his work, Staszewski found that it was only about 20% detection rate. But there were some people who were like mine whisperers. They could do it at 90%. And so he spent a lot of time with these people. These people actually were using strategies that they were able to get at explicitly in interviewing these master mine detectors. They had strategies having to do with their movements of the metal detector related to the auditory signals, combined with their experience in what patterns were associated with mines. And so they were able to explicitly discuss these strategies, and then they created a training course. And after that training course, everyone could do it at 90%. Now, something very interesting about this is that during the time this study was taking place, a new technology was developed with sensors that was less dependent on metal. And so they thought that with that, they wouldn't really need to worry about this training session anymore. But even with the new technology, the detection rate just plummeted with less than 20% actually. And so they had to go through the cognitive systems engineering approach again and look at the people who were doing it well with the new technology, design training, and then everyone could get up to 90% again. So what is the moral of this story and how does it apply to our field? Certainly within systems, the human behavior is what's most important. Always more important than any sort of technological development. So sometimes we go backwards in trying to support professionals. So we try to develop the perfect system, like the perfect rating scale, or the perfect tool, the perfect test. And then we impose it on the users, just like we impose the new landmine technology. And then we assume, well, if they don't mess it up, then the system will work perfectly. But it really should be done the other way around, right? I mean, the idea is that we need to look at the people who are masters. And we in our field, we compare experts and novices. Sometimes we only define that in terms of how many years they've been on the job, really. But we need to find better ways of defining who are masters. So in terms of their superior performance, right? So what makes an expert test developer, an efficient grader, someone who gives the most efficient feedback? Maybe there's someone in your school who just gives amazing feedback. So how can we actually retroactively engineer these strategies and then support the training for other people? Because you don't have to just have it. You don't have to have natural talent, is what this system is also telling us. That everyone can learn it as long as we're able to put our finger on exactly what makes that expertise. Okay, so now let's actually move to the sociocultural sort of side of professional development for professional groups. Some of these are maybe ones you recognize more. These are all different types of models that are used for professional development through a sociocultural framework. We have PLCs, professional learning communities, coaching, apprenticeship learning, peer mentoring, or indigenous learning approaches, such as learning circles. Now, this is the next question that I have for you all. What models for professional development have you actually experienced? Or have you actually been a part of? Maybe you've run some, or maybe you've been part or collaborators in some of them. So if you could just put all of the numbers that apply to you in the chat, that would be great. You see in the picture here, as we're waiting for people to put in their answers in the chat, that this is a PLC that I'm involved. This is a group of Haitian high school teachers. Can you spot me in the crowd? And we've been involved since 2017. These people have learned to be able to facilitate professional development activities within their own schools. Oh, thanks. The answers are really starting to pour in now. I'm seeing that many of you have had experience with some of these activities. I see fewer for coaching, which I'm not surprised. That's more associated with some more corporate environments, but I'm seeing apprenticeship learning, PLCs, and then I'm seeing also some other sorts of collaborative activities. I'm not seeing a lot of 7s. Okay, interesting. Okay, so just kind of to summarize. For students and test takers, I'm saying that literacy might not be the best term, that maybe we can talk about their own learning in assessment as they're learning the language. So it's transparency, but it's transparency plus active participation in their assessment. For professionals, we're talking about expertise and competency development using sociocultural approaches as well as cognitive approaches. For the wider public, maybe this is where the term literacy, there's many meanings for the term literacy, but if we talk about it as sort of a basic understanding of the foundational principles of assessment, then we need to be able to work towards that. And I think it has a lot to do with dispelling misunderstandings. And so just in the last couple of minutes here, I'd like to talk about this last group. I want to talk about how we can work to build sort of a language assessment literacy bridge with them, with the public, with the media, and somehow get a more of an influence than we have now on how language assessment is reported, how it's represented and understood. Now, I'm using the term advocacy here. By advocacy, I mean providing public support for people and for ideas. So it can mean providing opportunities for learning, right? Learning the basic concepts that we all know, and so that these people can feel more informed. And also we have a moral imperative to find the time to actually counter misunderstandings that exist, that run rampant really, about educational assessment more generally and about language assessment specifically. So now I say here that we can be complicit, and this actually goes back to what Barry was saying a bit about working as silos and having a bit of arrogance for people who become specialists in language assessment. It's nice to be thought of as a specialist. So once you've achieved that position, your first instinct might not be to give away that power, and power in the form of knowledge, to everyone else, right? Also, we might not be that motivated to open up the curtain because we know that things are not that certain in our profession. Our work is really a lot messier than we portray it to be. And maybe we don't want to show everyone our messy house. So I think that might have something to do with it too. But one of the most prevalent misunderstandings is the infallibility of tests and also our own infallibility as people who are assessing. And we know that's not true, right? This unquestioned tests, the unquestioned truth of tests, that they reveal sort of truth to the world. See, this is something that hasn't changed from when Alana Shoemi first talked about this, when she wrote about the power of tests 20 years ago. We know that we can make wonderful tests, but the best tests only collect a small amount of information. The best tests only collect a small amount of information. And it might not be the right information. And this is not known well enough. Also, the fact that we're objective in our measurement. Measurement in educational field is not like measurement in science, right? This is not putting up a measurement tape. If someone asked me to develop a test for a certain purpose for a certain group of people, I could develop a test that I know everyone would pass or that everyone would fail, right? This is not an objective measurement. And that's also a very common misunderstanding, isn't it? So overall, just to finish up here, we can't keep our power to ourselves. See, these basic concepts about language assessment aren't even all that difficult, right? We need to inject more doubt, more healthy skepticism into this process. And so here are some examples of how we can do this on the slide. And we need to find the time to do this. And we're very busy, right? And sometimes it requires us taking the initiative and us contacting groups who hadn't contacted us because we want to share understandings about these misunderstandings with them. But we have to put ourselves out there. The more we do that, the more language assessment literacy we push into the system, maybe the less misuse of assessments we'll have. So with that, I'll wait for your questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Baker. That was very, very insightful. I think we had a few comments, and just there's a lot of conversation in the comment section. Erika Hiko mentioned something about the assessment bit of how students can be a part of the assessment part. And she said it would be great idea try to adapt to our culture. It would have been greater to see students studying, not because they need it, but because they find languages interesting. And then Hector comment on that thread, we're the ones who create that culture. Students are pretty much conditioned to what teachers define as learning or achievement. So how can we, encourage these students to really see beyond assessment, perhaps?
Yeah, it's very true that we struggle to motivate our students. And except I personally am never motivated when I feel like I have no control, when things are just happening to me, right? It's difficult to engage in a process like that. So, I mean, this is not new, the idea of engaging people being assessed in their assessment, practicing some of these assessment practices, being allowed to question these assessment practices and even negotiate some of them. And this, I find that any activity I do with my language students, when they take over my job in any way, is very motivating. Certainly with peer assessment or this assignment I was talking about, my first project where students actually graded them, graded samples, they always were stricter. And we would laugh about it. They would always be kind of relieved that I was the one grading them and not themselves.
That's great. We had a great conversation here in the comment section, feedback on how it's important for ministries and the institutions to be involved in the whole process, not just top down, but also, talking to teachers in order to bring the assessment to the table at the operational level where, in the classroom, it's so important. We do have one more question here. The healthy skepticism of the general public. How can we do that in high stakes contexts without generating panic?
See, I can take a position, a disinterested position, because I don't belong to an exam board, right? I'm not selling an exam or promoting an exam. So I have a different perspective from people who are actually promoting products and have a commercial interest, and that makes sense. This is not a criticism. I think that very often exam boards can be responsible in some ways, in that they have very detailed programs of research, and they are dedicated to finding ways to make their research more accessible to the public, and all of that is good. You see that the researchers talk about how, for example, the results of their test scores should be combined with other sources of information to make decisions. They discuss the types of decisions that can be made. They discuss the limits of what can be understood with the assessments that they're offering. Unfortunately, though, marketing departments of the same exam boards might not be giving the same messages. And I'm wondering if there's any way we could find a happy medium between painting a realistic portrait of what exams can do and defending the fact that you have a very high quality one. I think this is the tightrope that needs to be walked.
I guess it's bringing business with the academics to have a more clear language on how to convey the message.
That's right. And so the infallibility of the test that they're offering is sometimes implicit in promotional messages more than I think it should be responsibly. Yeah.
Great. Very interesting. And then one last question, perhaps. You've mentioned a lot of your peer-to-peer assessment. So what problems might occur or have occurred when implementing peer and self-assessment in the CLI context? How would you or have you overcome these problems?
Okay. The CLI context? Content and language integrated instruction, is that what they're
I believe
referring to?
Diana, if you want to.
I want to conceive.
See if you can bring that.
But peer grading and peer assessment are two different things. So if maybe that's the question. So in developmental, and I really like Barry's distinction between formative and assessment, formative and summative, instead calling them judgmental and developmental. So peers work on the developmental side, not the judgmental side, if that's maybe the quickest answer to that, if I've understood the question.
Yeah, I think that's what she meant. That's correct. Yeah. Perhaps one more. I'm getting excited here. People are just pouring in. That's great.
Thank you.
This is a good one for teachers. So could you tell a little bit more about expertise in assessment for teachers? In many regions, there are no internship options. Do you think collaborative projects led by teachers themselves working on their own might counterbalance it?
Well, I can certainly talk about the context in Haiti, where I work with groups of teachers who have maybe never had any formal teaching training. And so whatever they learn about teaching is on the job, and they don't have access to a lot of resources or materials. And so they have to be able to learn from each other. And in this context as well, it was very interesting for me. I mean, I discovered what I learned about that context. I mean, I learned much more than they ever will. But in the context, these teachers became experts themselves and went out into their own communities and started offering workshops and professional trainings to teachers in their schools and in their communities. And initially, this was met with a lot of resistance because they weren't used to it. They weren't used to this, the information that was available to them. And they even thought, oh, what's the catch? Are you going to charge me for this? What's going on here? So after that initial resistance was overcome, it ended up being the interest that was shown that teachers who are already overworked, but were so starved for any kind of opportunity for their own professional development, because they're in language classrooms the same as any other language teacher who's got tons of resources. They see the same problems with motivation. The same, issues with assessment that we see. And so we found that this on the ground sort of professional learning communities spreading out through networks work the best in our context, because I've also at the same time tried to work from the top down, working with the Ministry of Education, the Minister of Education, to enact professional development guidelines for teachers. And in this context, that's slow, ineffective, and it just does not seem to have the same impact as working from the bottom up. That's what I might say to that. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's a great way to end. I think that's where the power is. It's lying within, who is doing all the work and seeing the transformation on the ground. So that's a great way to end this talk. So thank you, Dr. Baker. We look forward to continue learning from you and to have you in future New Directions events.